Welcome to Histopia. Today, we're embarking on a journey through time, through sand, stone, and memory, uncovering the entire history of Egypt, from its prehistoric roots to the final breath of its ancient civilization. This is not just the story of pharaohs and pyramids, of gods and gold. It's the saga of a civilization that endured for over 3,000 years, longer than any empire in history. When we talk about Egypt, we often think of majestic pyramids, mysterious tombs, and a pantheon of gods unlike any other. But behind the myths and the monuments lies a deeply human story. One of ingenuity, resilience, conflict, and extraordinary cultural evolution. It is the legacy of a people who harnessed the life-giving Nile, who wrote in sacred symbols, and who built monuments that still defy time. In the next hour, we will walk through the entire timeline of ancient Egypt, beginning before the pyramids were even a dream, moving through the rise and fall of mighty dynasties, and ending with the final echoes of Egypt's independence as foreign powers loomed. But let's begin at the very beginning. Long before kings ruled from gilded thrones, long before hieroglyphs told epic tales on temple walls, there were nomads. Tribes of people living along the fertile banks of the Nile River. This was around 10,000 BCE, prehistoric Egypt. At this time, the Sahara wasn't the vast desert we know today. It was green, lush, even dotted with lakes. But as the climate changed and the region began to dry out, humans slowly migrated toward the Nile Valley. There, they found something miraculous. Every year, the Nile flooded, predictably and generously, leaving behind rich, black silt. This gift of the Nile, as the ancient historian Herodotus called it, transformed the land into a cradle of agriculture. Over time, small farming communities evolved into organized societies. These early Egyptians grew wheat and barley, raised cattle, and crafted pottery. They began to build permanent homes, bury their dead with care, and, most importantly, formed the roots of what would become a powerful and complex culture. By around 4000 BCE, these communities had begun to divide into two distinct regions: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, near the Nile Delta. These were more than just geographical terms. They represented two separate cultural spheres. Upper Egypt wore the white crown, Lower Egypt wore the red. And for centuries, they existed separately, until a powerful leader would bring them together. Enter Narmer, also known as Menes, the first pharaoh of a unified Egypt. Around 3100 BCE, Narmer is believed to have conquered Lower Egypt, merging the two lands into one kingdom and establishing the first dynasty. This marks the beginning of what historians call the early dynastic period, a time when writing first appeared in Egypt in the form of hieroglyphics, when kingship was established as divine, and when the foundations of the state were laid. The unification of Egypt was more than a political act, it was a cultural revolution. Narmer's famous palette, a ceremonial artifact, depicts him wearing both crowns, symbolizing his rule over the two lands. It is one of the oldest historical documents in the world. But Egypt was only getting started. Around 2686 BCE, a new era began, the Old Kingdom, often called the Age of the Pyramids. This was a time of great innovation, wealth, and centralized power. Pharaohs ruled as living gods, intermediaries between the heavens and earth, and their tombs would become monuments of cosmic significance. The most famous of these rulers was Pharaoh Djoser, who commissioned the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, the first pyramid in Egypt, designed by his brilliant architect, Imhotep. This was no ordinary tomb. It was a statement of divine authority, a stairway to the afterlife. Then came the Fourth Dynasty, and with it, a name that still echoes across history: Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. It was under Khufu's reign that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built, a staggering feat of engineering that remains one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. With over 2 million limestone blocks, some weighing more than 70 tons, the pyramid aligned with the stars and pointed to eternity. Khufu was followed by his son, Djedefre, and then Khafre, builder of the second pyramid at Giza, and the guardian Great Sphinx, whose silent gaze has watched over the desert for 4,500 years. But even greatness has its price. As pyramids grew larger and more elaborate, they drained the kingdom's wealth. Local governors, known as nomarchs, began to gain power, challenging the authority of the pharaoh. Over time, central control weakened. The unity that Narmer once forged began to crack. By around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed, giving way to a time of political chaos and fragmentation known as the First Intermediate Period. Egypt was no longer one kingdom. It was a patchwork of rival rulers, struggling to control different regions. This was not just a time of decline, but also of resilience. Local leaders kept the culture alive, and art and literature continued to flourish, even in dark times. Eventually, a powerful family rose in the city of Thebes, in Upper Egypt. They would reunite the country once more, ushering in a new golden age. Out of the darkness of the First Intermediate Period rose a new light, the Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2055 BCE, with Mentuhotep II of Thebes. He was the one who successfully reunited Egypt under a single rule, marking the start of the 11th dynasty. His reign ushered in a time of stability, prosperity, and renewed artistic expression. Unlike the Old Kingdom pharaohs who obsessed over building monumental tombs, the rulers of the Middle Kingdom focused more on governing effectively, expanding agriculture, and reconnecting with the people. This period is sometimes called the Classical Age of Ancient Egypt. Literature flourished. Tales like the story of Sinew and wisdom texts like the instructions of Amenemhat reflected a deeper philosophical and moral outlook. Art became more realistic, showing even the imperfections of the human form, a stark contrast to the idealized figures of earlier centuries. Pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, especially Senusret III and Amenemhat III, were strong rulers and builders. Senusret III was a formidable military leader who campaigned in Nubia, expanding Egypt's southern borders and fortifying trade routes. His efforts allowed Egypt to gain control over gold mines, incense, ivory, and exotic animals, increasing both wealth and international prestige. Yet, just as before, power began to slip once again. Weakened leadership, infighting, and economic pressures led to the decline of the Middle Kingdom. Around 1700 BCE, a group of foreign rulers known as the Hyksos entered the Delta region. The name Hyksos means rulers of foreign lands, and they brought something new to Egypt, the horse-drawn chariot. Though often portrayed negatively in later Egyptian writings, the Hyksos weren't simply barbaric invaders. They adopted Egyptian customs, gods, and administration. Their capital, Avaris, in the Nile Delta, became a thriving center of culture and trade. Still, for many Egyptians, the presence of foreign rulers was a humiliation. And so began a long and gradual push to reclaim native control. It was again Thebes, the old unifier, that would rise to the challenge. Led by Seqenenretau and his sons Kamos and later Ahmose I, the Egyptians launched a series of military campaigns that ultimately drove the Hyksos out. Ahmose I succeeded around 1550 BCE, and with his victory, he founded the 18th dynasty, marking the beginning of Egypt's most powerful and glorious era, the New Kingdom. This was Egypt at its absolute peak, a time of military conquests, immense wealth, architectural marvels, and some of the most legendary rulers in history. Ahmose I rebuilt Egypt, stabilized the government, and set the stage for what would become an empire stretching from Nubia in the south to Syria in the northeast. His successors continued this expansion. Thutmose I, a warrior pharaoh, led successful campaigns into the Levant and Nubia. He was among the first to be buried in the Valley of the Kings, abandoning the pyramid tradition in favor of secret cliffside tombs designed to prevent looting. Then came Hatshepsut, one of the most fascinating and enigmatic rulers in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and became regent for her stepson Thutmose III. But instead of stepping aside when he came of age, she declared herself pharaoh, ruling in her own right. To legitimize her reign, she dressed as a king, even wearing the ceremonial false beard, and claimed divine birth. Her reign was not marked by war but by peace, diplomacy, and economic prosperity. She launched a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back incense, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, nestled against the cliffs of Thebes, stands as one of Egypt's architectural masterpieces, a statement of power, elegance, and divine favor. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III finally took the throne and led Egypt into its greatest military expansion. Often called the Napoleon of Egypt, he never lost a battle in nearly 20 years of campaigns. Under his rule, Egypt reached the height of its territorial power. But the story of Egypt is not just about swords and stone, it's about belief. And perhaps no ruler challenged that belief system more than Akhenaten. Originally named Amenhotep IV, he ascended to the throne in the mid-14th century BCE. But instead of worshipping Ammonius and the traditional gods of Egypt, Akhenaten proclaimed the sun disk Aten as the one true god. He changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for Aten, and moved the capital to a brand new city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. This was a radical religious revolution. Temples were closed. Old priesthoods lost power. Art became more intimate and expressive, showing the royal family in natural poses and moments of affection. But Akhenaten's reign was deeply controversial. After his death, the city of Amarna was abandoned, and his successors erased his name from monuments, branding him a heretic. One of those successors was a boy king, who would become a legend, not for his deeds in life, but for what was found in death. Tutankhamun, or King Tut, ascended the throne as a child and reigned for just 9 years. He reversed his father's religious reforms and restored the traditional gods. But his true fame came over 3,000 years later, in 1922, when British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered his nearly intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The treasures inside, golden coffins, jeweled masks, chariots, stunned the world and reignited global fascination with ancient Egypt. But while Tutankhamun was a minor king, the next great pharaoh would be anything but. Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, reigned for an astonishing 66 years. He was a warrior, builder, and propagandist par excellence. He fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, one of the earliest battles in recorded history for which we have detailed accounts, and later signed what is often considered the world's first peace treaty. Ramses built more monuments than any other pharaoh, including the massive Abu Simbel temples, carved directly into the cliffs of Nubia. His image was everywhere. Dozens of statues, carvings, and temples reinforced his godlike status. He even constructed a new capital city, Pyramus, in the Delta, a glittering symbol of his power. By the time of his death at around 90 years old, Egypt was still mighty, but the seeds of decline had already been sown. When Ramses the Great died around 1213 BCE, Egypt was still basking in the glow of his immense legacy. But the truth is, his long and prosperous reign was the final peak of the new kingdom. What followed was a slow and painful decline. His successors, including his son Merenta, struggled to maintain the empire. Internal unrest, external threats, and economic strain began to eat away at the stability Ramses had once commanded. As the 20th dynasty wore on, Egypt faced its most mysterious and devastating threat yet, the arrival of the Sea Peoples. Around 1200 BCE, these seafaring raiders, whose exact origins remain debated, attacked many powerful civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, including the Hittites and Mycenaeans. Egypt, too, came under siege. Ramses III, a later pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, managed to defeat them in a fierce naval battle, which he proudly recorded on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. But the cost of the wars was enormous. Though victorious, Egypt was drained. Grain shortages, labor strikes, the first recorded in history, plagued the land. Tombs were looted, temples fell into disrepair, and royal authority weakened. The empire was shrinking, both in territory and influence. By 1070 BCE, the new kingdom came to an end, giving way to the Third Intermediate Period, a time of fragmentation and foreign influence. Egypt was no longer united under a single, powerful ruler. Instead, local dynasties, Libyan chieftains, and high priests of Ammonius in Thebes each claimed a piece of Egypt's once glorious kingdom. In the north, the city of Tanis became a new capital under Libyan kings. In the south, priestly families held sway. Though there were moments of revival, the power of the pharaohs was now a shadow of what it once was. Yet Egypt's story was far from over. In the 8th century BCE, a surprising new power emerged, not from the north, but from the south. The kingdom of Kush, based in Nubia, had long been influenced by Egyptian culture. Its rulers worshipped Egyptian gods, built pyramids, and even wrote in hieroglyphs. One of these kings, Pi, set his sights on Egypt. In a bold campaign, he marched north and conquered much of the land, declaring himself pharaoh of a reunified Egypt. Thus began the 25th dynasty, often called the Kushite dynasty. These black pharaohs from the south ruled with deep reverence for Egyptian tradition, restoring temples, reviving art, and promoting religious unity. But while the Kushites brought stability, they also faced powerful external enemies. Chief among them, the rising empire of Assyria. Around 671 BCE, the Assyrians invaded Egypt with brutal force. King Esarhaddon and later his son Ashurbanipal sacked cities and forced the Kushite pharaohs to retreat back to Nubia. Egypt once again fell into foreign hands. What followed was the Late Period, a time marked by short-lived dynasties, frequent invasions, and remarkable cultural resilience. Despite the political chaos, Egyptians never let go of their traditions. Even under foreign rule, they continued building temples, preserving sacred texts, and honoring the gods. The 26th dynasty, known as the Sate period, attempted a nationalist revival. Based in the city of Sais in the Delta, these pharaohs brought relative peace and launched public works projects that echoed the grandeur of earlier times. But peace was fragile. In 525 BCE, a new conqueror arrived, Cambyses II, king of Persia. He defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, where, according to legend, the Persians used sacred cats and other animals as shields, knowing the Egyptians wouldn't harm them. Egypt was absorbed into the vast Achaemenid Persian Empire, becoming a satrapy, a province. Under Persian rule, Egypt was taxed heavily and governed from afar, though some local customs were tolerated. There were brief periods of independence, such as the rebellion of Amartius in the 28th dynasty, but they were short-lived. The 30th dynasty, led by Nectanebo I and II, was the last native Egyptian ruling house. In 343 BCE, the Persians reconquered Egypt, crushing Nectanebo II's resistance. Egypt's long history as an independent civilization came to an end. But just a decade later, a new force swept in from the west, a general with dreams of empire and immortality, Alexander the Great. In 332 BCE, Alexander entered Egypt without a fight. The Persian satraps surrendered, and the Egyptians, resentful of Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. He visited the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa Oasis, where he was declared a son of the god. Soon after, he founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. Alexander's death in 323 BCE left his empire in pieces, and Egypt fell into the hands of one of his generals, Ptolemy I Soter. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, the final chapter of ancient Egypt. The Ptolemies were Greek rulers who ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. They brought Hellenistic culture, but they also embraced Egyptian traditions. The Ptolemies styled themselves as pharaohs, built temples in traditional styles, and supported the priesthood. Alexandria, their capital, became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a center of learning, philosophy, science, and culture. The Great Library of Alexandria attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. Mathematicians like Euclid, astronomers like Eratosthenes, and physicians like Herophilus flourished under the Ptolemies. But eventually, dynastic infighting, corruption, and Roman interference brought the kingdom to its knees. And then came Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt, the last of the pharaohs. The sands of time were running out for Egypt's ancient civilization. By the 1st century BCE, The once mighty kingdom had been reduced to a pawn in the growing tensions between Rome's powerful generals. Enter the most iconic figure in Egyptian history, Cleopatra VII. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra was not only the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, but also one of the most shrewd and politically astute monarchs in antiquity. She was not Egyptian by blood. Her lineage was Macedonian Greek, but she embraced Egyptian language, culture, and religion. She was the first Ptolemy in centuries to learn and speak the Egyptian language. When Cleopatra came to the throne at just 18, co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, Egypt was deeply in debt and politically unstable. But Cleopatra was not content to be a figurehead. Civil war erupted between Cleopatra and her brother, just as Rome was descending into its own internal chaos between Julius Caesar, Pompey, and the Roman Senate. In 48 BCE, Pompey fled to Egypt after being defeated by Caesar. Ptolemy XIII had Pompey murdered, hoping to win Caesar's favor. Instead, the act horrified Caesar, who then stayed in Egypt to sort out the conflict. And there, Cleopatra made her boldest move. She smuggled herself into Caesar's presence, according to legend, wrapped in a rug, and charmed the Roman general. Their alliance was political, but it was also personal. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers and had a child, Caesarion, whom she claimed as Caesar's heir. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra regained her throne and ruled with a new brother-husband, Ptolemy XIV, though she effectively held power alone. Her reign brought stability and relative prosperity. Trade flowed, the temples were restored, and Cleopatra presented herself as both Isis incarnate and a queen worthy of the pharaohs. But peace was fleeting. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome. Cleopatra, realizing the shifting winds of power, aligned herself next with Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally and a member of the Second Triumvirate. Their relationship was both romantic and strategic. Antony needed Egypt's wealth for his campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman protection. Together, they had 3 children and declared ambitions to carve out a new Eastern Empire, one that challenged the rising dominance of Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and future Augustus. In 31 BCE, the showdown came at the Battle of Actium, a decisive naval conflict off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa, defeated the forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The couple fled to Egypt. 1 year later, in 30 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt. Faced with defeat and humiliation, Mark Antony committed suicide, reportedly falling on his sword after receiving false news of Cleopatra's death. Cleopatra soon followed, possibly by ASP bite, though the method remains a mystery. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt was no longer an independent kingdom. Octavian annexed it as a personal possession. Egypt was now a Roman province, and its incredible 3,000-year era of pharaohs, dynasties, and divine rule had come to an end. But the story of ancient Egypt didn't vanish. It transformed. Under Roman rule, Egypt became a vital grain supplier for the empire. The temples of Philae, Dendera, and Kam Ombo were still active. Egyptian priests continued to perform rituals. Hieroglyphs were still written, though increasingly they faded from everyday use. By the 4th century CE, with the rise of Christianity, the last vestiges of the old religion were outlawed. The Temple of Philae, dedicated to Isis, was closed by imperial decree. And with that, the last hieroglyph was inscribed in 394 CE, marking the symbolic end of ancient Egypt's spiritual identity. For over a millennium, the language and symbols of the ancient world fell silent. Their meaning was lost, their monuments misunderstood, and Egypt itself became a land of mystery and myth to the outside world. But Egypt's story wasn't over. In the centuries to come, Arab scholars, European travelers, and archaeological pioneers would begin uncovering its buried secrets. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799 and deciphered by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, unlocked the key to reading hieroglyphs, reviving the voices of pharaohs long thought lost to time. Today, the legacy of ancient Egypt endures not just in museums or textbooks, but in our imagination. In its temples, its gods, its myths, and in the enduring question: how did a civilization so ancient, so enduring, rise from the banks of the Nile and influence the world for over 3,000 years? Ancient Egypt was more than a timeline of kings and conquests, it was a cradle of human innovation. Let's now explore the achievements and lasting contributions of this extraordinary civilization. From their deep understanding of science and mathematics to their sacred art, monumental architecture, and spiritual worldview. Let's begin with one of Egypt's greatest innovations: writing. The Egyptians developed one of the earliest writing systems in the world: hieroglyphics. Appearing as early as 3100 BCE, hieroglyphs weren't just symbols. They were a sophisticated combination of sounds, ideas, and pictorial art. Writing was central to Egyptian society. It allowed priests to record sacred texts, kings to issue decrees, and scribes to document everything from taxes to medical prescriptions. Beyond hieroglyphics, they also developed hieratic and later demotic scripts, simplified, faster styles used for day-to-day affairs. These texts were written on papyrus, a paper-like material made from the papyrus plant that grew along the Nile, centuries before parchment or modern paper existed. Speaking of documentation, Egypt made major contributions to mathematics. They understood geometry, crucial for building their temples and pyramids. The Rhind mathematical papyrus from around 1650 BCE reveals knowledge of fractions, algebraic equations, and even pi-like approximations used in architecture. When you look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, you're not just seeing stone stacked on stone. You're seeing a testament to precise measurements, advanced engineering, and spatial awareness. The pyramid's base is nearly perfectly level, aligned to the cardinal points, and the internal chambers required a mastery of load-bearing physics. Even today, engineers marvel at how such accuracy was achieved with copper tools and manpower alone. Now, let's talk about medicine. Egyptian physicians were highly respected, even in other cultures like Greece. They treated injuries, performed surgeries, and had a strong understanding of the human body. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is a medical text dating back to around 1600 BCE, detailing trauma surgery and diagnoses with surprising accuracy. It separates magical treatment from practical medicine, remarkably modern for its time. They used bandages, sutures, and had herbal knowledge to treat infections. They even understood how to check pulses and described organs like the liver and heart with significant detail. Medicine, like everything in Egypt, was deeply tied to religion. Disease wasn't just a physical problem, it was a spiritual imbalance. That brings us to their most defining feature: their belief system. The Egyptians believed in an afterlife, a continuation of existence that was even more important than life itself. Death was a transition, not an end. They developed elaborate rituals around death, most famously the process of mummification. The goal? To preserve the body so the soul, made up of multiple parts like the Ka, Ba, and Ak, could recognize it and return. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and incantations, was often buried with the deceased to guide them through the underworld. The final test? The weighing of the heart, where the heart was balanced against the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul could enter paradise. If heavier, it was devoured by Ammit, a fearsome demon. To house the dead, especially the elite, Egyptians constructed awe-inspiring tombs. The pyramids, particularly at Giza, remain among the most iconic structures on Earth. Built over 4,500 years ago, they are the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. But their architecture extended far beyond pyramids. The massive columns of Karnak, the grandeur of Luxor, and the cliff-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings demonstrate a civilization obsessed with scale, symmetry, and celestial alignment. Many of these structures were aligned with the stars. Temples were built to capture the light of solstices. The Nile's flooding was predicted based on astronomical observations. The Egyptians created a 365-day calendar divided into 12 months of 30 days, with 5 additional festival days. This calendar system would later influence Roman timekeeping, and through them, our modern calendar. Let's not forget art, meticulous, symbolic, and deeply spiritual. Egyptian art wasn't about realism, it was about order. Figures were shown in profile with shoulders forward, ensuring visibility and symbolism. Gods were depicted with animal heads to show their powers. Pharaohs were idealized, eternally youthful, eternally divine. Everything in Egyptian culture aimed to reflect Ma'at, the concept of cosmic balance, truth, and harmony. Whether in law, art, or architecture, this guiding principle was at the heart of Egyptian life. Even their economy was advanced for its time. Egypt's wealth came from the Nile River, which provided fertile soil for agriculture. Wheat, barley, flax, and papyrus were core products. Trade routes extended from Nubia, Levant, and across the Mediterranean. They traded for incense, ivory, cedar wood, and lapis lazuli. Gold from Nubia fueled both temples and politics. And socially, Egypt had a surprisingly fluid class system. While the pharaoh and elite priests held power, skilled scribes and craftsmen could rise in status. Women in Egypt had more rights than in many contemporary societies. They could own land, divorce, inherit wealth, and some even became pharaohs, like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra. By any measure, scientific, cultural, artistic, or spiritual, ancient Egypt left a legacy unmatched in its time. But what is perhaps most remarkable is not just what they built, but how long it lasted. For over 3,000 years, the civilization of Egypt remained uniquely itself. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreigners came and went. But the Egyptian worldview, its gods, its language, its sacred geography, remained intact for millennia. 4 centuries after the fall of ancient Egypt, much of its knowledge, language, and culture lay buried beneath the sands of time. Temples crumbled. Tombs were looted. The hieroglyphs etched on walls became indecipherable mysteries. Egypt, once a beacon of civilization, became to outsiders a realm of legend, its monuments misunderstood, its history fragmented. But then came a turning point. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt, not just with soldiers, but with scholars, artists, and scientists. He was fascinated by ancient civilizations and wanted to document every artifact, temple, and inscription. 1 year later, in 1799, Napoleon's forces discovered something extraordinary in the town of Rosetta, a broken slab of black basalt bearing 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. This was the Rosetta Stone, and it would unlock the silent voices of the past. Enter Jean-François Champollion, a young French scholar who, after years of study, deciphered the hieroglyphs in 1822. By comparing the Greek and Egyptian texts, he realized that the hieroglyphs represented both sounds and ideas, just like a modern alphabet. For the first time in over 1,400 years, the language of the pharaohs could be read again. This marked the birth of Egyptology, the modern study of ancient Egypt. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists from Europe and around the world descended upon Egypt. Temples were excavated. Tombs were opened. Artifacts were shipped to museums. And with each discovery, the pieces of Egypt's long-lost story were slowly reassembled. One of the most sensational moments came in 1922, when Howard Carter discovered the nearly intact tomb of Tutankhamun, the Boy King. The tomb's golden treasures stunned the world: solid gold coffins, chariots, jewelry, and the now iconic golden death mask. "Wonderful things," Carter said when he first peered inside. And indeed they were. Tutankhamun had been a relatively minor pharaoh in life. But in death, he became the most famous of them all, his tomb capturing the imagination of millions and sparking a global fascination with ancient Egypt. But Egypt's legacy isn't limited to tombs and treasures. Egypt's influence is everywhere. In architecture, we see echoes of obelisks, columns, and pyramids in capitals around the world. The pyramid on the back of the US dollar, with its Eye of Providence, is a direct nod to ancient symbols of power and mystery. In science, the ancient Egyptians laid groundwork in medicine, astronomy, and engineering, disciplines we still rely on today. In religion, ideas of resurrection, judgment after death, and eternal life shaped early Christian and Islamic thought. In popular culture, Egypt has inspired everything from Hollywood blockbusters to video games, from fashion to novels. Pharaohs, mummies, and ancient gods remain staples of storytelling because Egypt taps into something primal in us, the fascination with time, death, power, and the unknown. But beyond the myths and monuments, there is a living Egypt, a modern nation proud of its heritage, where Arabic echoes over the same lands once ruled by Ramses and Cleopatra. And increasingly, Egyptian archaeologists and scholars are reclaiming their own history, restoring, preserving, and reinterpreting their ancient past for the next generation. So what is the ultimate legacy of ancient Egypt? It's not just the pyramids or the pharaohs. It's the idea that humanity, even in its earliest stages, was capable of greatness, of building, creating, writing, healing, and imagining worlds beyond their own. Egypt reminds us that even in the cradle of time, people dreamed big. And their dreams still stand, etched in stone, inscribed in legend, and burning brightly in our collective memory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the entire history of ancient Egypt. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's great civilizations. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.